In the shadows of ancient Athens, celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and art, there existed a parallel world rarely acknowledged in marble statues or heroic epics. Beneath the city's polished ideals, an immense system of exploitation thrived quietly, sustaining prosperity while erasing countless lives from memory. Welcome to Hidden Secret Tales, where we explore the histories left deliberately untold, stories buried not because they lacked importance, but because they revealed uncomfortable truths. This is the story of women whose suffering underrode one of history's most admired civilizations. In the crowded quarters of Athens, brothels operated openly and efficiently, woven into the city's economic and legal framework. A single night with a woman could cost no more than 2 barley flatbreads, sometimes less than a jug of inexpensive wine. These women were known as porni, a term that reduced them to commodities rather than human beings. The word itself reflected their status: bought, sold, discussed, and discarded with no expectation of dignity. Court records and surviving speeches from figures such as Lysias and Dio provide stark insight into their lives. Many of these women were compelled to serve multiple clients daily, often from morning until night, with earnings so small they barely secured minimal food. Meanwhile, brothel owners accumulated wealth, paying regulated taxes that flowed directly into the Athenian treasury. Exploitation was not hidden, it was normalized, regulated, and profitable. Athenian law imposed no minimum age for entering prostitution. Archaeological evidence and historical documentation suggest that girls barely into adolescence were drawn into this system. Once enslaved, they were permanently marked, branded to signify ownership. These marks were not symbolic, they were deliberate reminders that escape, identity, and autonomy had been stripped away. Life inside these establishments followed a strict logic of control. Resistance was met with punishment designed not merely to discipline, but to extinguish hope. Historical accounts describe public beatings, deprivation, and isolation used to enforce compliance. New arrivals were subjected to brutal initiation rituals conducted openly to send a clear message to others. Resistance would only bring greater suffering. One traveler's account describes how these rituals were intended to break the spirit quickly, ensuring submission before defiance could take root. Onlookers, both patrons and fellow captives, were forced to witness these acts, transforming private trauma into collective warning. Compassion was absent. Cruelty became spectacle. Within this system, novelty carried value. Newly arrived women commanded higher prices, not because of skill or agency, but because they had not yet been visibly worn down. Contemporary writers recorded such transactions with chilling detachment, likening them to ordinary market exchanges. Privacy was non-existent. Work occurred in shared spaces divided by cloth or mats, where pain, exhaustion, and fear blended into constant background noise. Every sound became part of the environment, normalized, ignored, or even mocked. At this point, it is worth pausing to acknowledge why these stories matter. Channels like Hidden Secret Tales exist not to shock, but to remember, to restore historical voices erased by comfort and convenience. These women lived, suffered, and died within systems praised for enlightenment. Their stories deserve space beside the names of generals and philosophers. Brothel owners organized women into rigid categories, each tailored to specific demand. Some were classified by origin, physical traits, or perceived temperament. Others were valued precisely because they resisted, appealing to those who equated dominance with entertainment. Surviving artwork from the period suggests that coercion and humiliation were sometimes transformed into social amusement. Graffiti found on brothel walls reveals how violence was commercialized. Certain patrons paid extra to inflict lasting harm, leaving visible marks that served as proof of power. Injuries were not hidden, they were advertised. Some women were known specifically for enduring punishment, their suffering reframed as a service. This system thrived in stark contrast to Athens' intellectual reputation. While philosophers debated ethics and virtue, cruelty toward enslaved women generated reliable income. The contradiction was not accidental, it was foundational. Daily brutality intensified during religious festivals. During major celebrations, women were sometimes distributed freely under the guise of ritual observance. Historical accounts describe large crowds, intoxication, music, and complete abandonment of restraint. These events were framed as sacred, though the consequences were devastating. Medical writings from the era document deaths linked to such gatherings, caused by trauma, exhaustion, and neglect. Religious authorities often justified these outcomes as offerings to the gods. When celebrations ended, survivors were returned to their previous conditions. The dead were disposed of beyond city limits, denied burial rights afforded even to the poorest citizens. These events were not anomalies, they were extensions of daily practices. Punishment was constant. Beatings, confinement, exposure to extreme weather, and deprivation were used routinely. Owners referred to these measures euphemistically, presenting cruelty as correction. Ordinary objects became tools of enforcement. Over time, women learned that visible emotion invited harsher consequences. Survival required silence. In a society that celebrated physical perfection in sculpture and art, these women's bodies told a different story, one of accumulated damage. Their forms became records of violence rather than ideals of beauty. Escape attempts were treated as property theft. Captured runaways faced public punishment meant to deter others. Some were permanently marked again, ensuring lifelong stigma. Court records describe punishments designed to humiliate and incapacitate rather than rehabilitate. Temples offered little refuge. Although some women sought sanctuary, priests often returned them in exchange for payment. Property rights outweighed divine mercy. Each failed escape reduced the likelihood of survival. Medical texts confirm that few women lived beyond early adulthood. Disease, untreated injuries, malnutrition, and exhaustion claimed lives quickly. Treatment was considered an unnecessary expense. Replacement was cheaper than care. Archaeological discoveries near former brothel districts reveal skeletal evidence of sustained trauma, fractured bones, spinal damage, and signs of chronic injury. These remains confirm what written records imply: systematic violence over prolonged periods. When women could no longer work, they were discarded. Some were left beyond the city walls, alive or dead. Athens' cultural achievements were built alongside these silent disappearances. Pregnancy was considered a financial liability. Owners used dangerous methods to prevent or terminate it. Surviving medical texts describe practices that endangered lives. When births occurred, conditions were unsanitary and unsupported. Infant remains discovered in waste sites indicate that survival beyond birth was rare. Legally, these women had no personhood. Debts were fabricated to justify continued control. Consent did not exist within the law. Court testimony from enslaved women was considered valid only under coercion. This reality stands in stark contrast to Athens' democratic ideals. Women, free or enslaved, were excluded entirely. Enslaved women occupied the lowest social tier, valued less than animals. Occasionally, a woman might experience marginal improvement through patronage or specialized training. These cases were rare and precarious. Favor could vanish instantly. Even those elevated to private quarters remained property. Historical records show that favored women were sometimes offered to guests as gestures of hospitality. Luxury did not equal freedom. Age eventually erased all privilege. Women who survived long enough faced abandonment and anonymity. Burial rights were denied. Many were discarded without names, markers, or memory. Archaeological evidence confirms this erasure. Remains found among household waste illustrate how society measured their worth. In a culture that immortalized warriors and leaders, these women were deliberately forgotten. Their suffering was also transformed into entertainment. Comedy, theater, and household art depicted women's humiliation as humor or decoration. Violence became aesthetic. Pain became background. Brothels paid steady taxes. Exploitation supported public works. Democracy flourished alongside systemic bondage. While philosophers debated virtue, human lives were traded nearby. The Parthenon's marble, the city's theaters, and its temples were funded in part by this economy. Athens' legacy rests not only on brilliance, but on silence. Modern retellings often sanitize this history. The suffering of countless women is omitted to preserve admiration, but absence does not equal insignificance. Their story remains etched in ruins, fragments, and shadows. This is why Hidden Secret Tales exists, to confront the past honestly, without comfort or distortion. These women were not footnotes, they were foundations. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story resonated, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts. Remembering is the first